It's Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. So, you probably heard, but the writer Jonathan Gold died last month of pancreatic cancer. He was only 57. He was the restaurant critic for the Los Angeles Times. His writing, which had appeared in LA Weekly, in Gourmet, and elsewhere, earned him a Pulitzer in 2007. To this date, he is still the only food critic to ever earn that honor. And when you're talking about Jonathan Gold, it's hard to overstate what he meant to the city of Los Angeles, where we record Bullseye every week, and to the food criticism world in general. His impact was enormous. There's his writing, elegant, personable, funny, meticulously researched. Then there's the places he'd write about. He covered fancy restaurants with tasting menus and $15 cocktails. And he'd also put a spotlight on restaurants that often get ignored by critics. Korean noodle shops, Oaxacan mole restaurants, crowded Sichuan cafes tucked away in the San Gabriel Valley. Not that other writers weren't covering those kinds of places, ever. But before Jonathan, they'd inevitably end up in a cheap eats column in the dining section or thrown together on a list of best-kept secrets in L.A. Jonathan Gold wrote those places into the exact same column as all the other restaurants. He celebrated them and honored them, and he worked just as hard, if not harder sometimes, to write authentically and informatively about the chefs, families, and traditions behind those restaurants. Anyway, all of that is to say that he will be sorely missed. I was lucky enough to get to talk to Jonathan Gold in 2011. You'll hear that conversation in a second. It was a few years after his Pulitzer, and 4 years before a local filmmaker named Laura Gabbert directed a documentary about him. She called it City of Gold. Here's a little bit from it.
I do all the stuff you're supposed to do. I always reserve under different names. I switch up the names I reserve under. I switch up the phone numbers that I reserve under. I mean, I have a whole series of throwaway phones that I use just for reservations. It's kind of like it's kind of like the fat man's version of the Bourne Identity, I think.
When I talked to Jonathan at my house in Los Angeles in 2011, I opened by asking about his L.A. roots. He's from South L.A.
Right. I grew up near, I guess, 63rd and Crenshaw.
My dad spent his teenage years in Glendale. He grew up till he was like 13 or something like that in Kansas City, but then lived in Glendale. And he's older than you are, Jonathan, but I remember him telling me one day about stealing his parents' car after they went to sleep and driving to the coast, which I guess, this would have been 1960-ish, was not the longest drive. I mean, a 45-minute drive maybe. Right. But when he described it, it was as though he was going to Canada. You know what I mean? Like it was like a whole different other world. And there's that sense in Los Angeles that, I don't know, I'm from San Francisco. I didn't feel in San Francisco of it being just a group of very individual worlds.
It is that, and it is not that. It's interesting that they both exist at the same time. For example, you can get in your car and you can drive for 100 miles on surface streets and still basically be in Los Angeles. I mean, the city names may change. It might become one of the small suburbs. You might be in Orange County. You might be, up towards Santa Barbara. But it's basically culturally Los Angeles. It's the city, there's really no end to it. Unlike, for example, even New York City. I mean, there is a point where the city ends and the suburbs begin, and it's a clear demarcation. And here, that really doesn't exist. But on the other hand, because you're dealing with, the vastness of the grid, you find that people tend to congregate in different ways than they might in a lot of the rest of the country. For example, in New York City, people entertain in restaurants because unless you're very rich, your apartment probably isn't great. Here, we have backyards. I mean, even people who aren't super well off have backyards, and they might have swimming pools, and they have palm trees, and they barbecue. I mean, that's what the socializing is. And the insularity is bad in a lot of ways. It's bad for the city politic, I think. But in a way, it's very, very good for food. Because you will have enclaves of, say, Koreans or Chinese or Mexicans, or even more specific, I mean, people from like one very specific region of China or one very specific region of Korea that have restaurants that are meant to satisfy them.
Your origin story is an interesting one. Like the Los Angeles of the 60s and 70s when you're growing up is this kind of classic Los Angeles that, like, one of the special things about Los Angeles is that this place is the place that invented, in many ways, contemporary mass eating. Like the themed food experience, the Taco Bell, all of these things are like special Los Angeles, the Tex-Mex restaurant. Like these are all special Los Angeles-y things. And often when you think of, when you go to like a Los Angeles thing from the 30s, that has been a Los Angeles institution, quote unquote, it's often a very, very early form of that. It's a very early form of Chili's or whatever.
It's not quite that simple. But there is some truth to that. There is a sense in which, because Hollywood and Los Angeles has been the source of so much mass culture in the United States, that the Los Angeles accent is like the one accent in the country that doesn't actually read as an accent. That music that comes out of studios in LA doesn't read as having an LA sound. It just has a sound. That whereas you could open a place called, Joe's New York Bar and Grill, and you'd know what they would serve, or Joe's Chicago hot dogs, and you'd have an idea what would be on the menu. But you could open a restaurant someplace called, Max's Los Angeles, and you'd have no idea what they would serve.
Probably avocados. That's about as far as you could get, right? It would involve avocados.
Maybe avocados. I mean, one of my favorite food essays from the 30s is by S.J. Perlman, piece in the New Yorker that was "Farewell, My Lovely Avocado."
So you started on this. You started on this project that is, I think, your famous origin story, which is eating your way from one end of Pico Boulevard to the other.
Yeah, I started at the old kosher butcher shop on Pico near Robertson.
And Pico is, for people who don't live in Los Angeles, it's an east-west street that basically goes from one end of Los Angeles to the other, and it's sort of in the middle enough to be in the middle, but it's also in the south enough to be genuinely sort of regular people-y, including every kind of ethnicity that lives in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I always think of it as LA's equivalent of like the tradesman's porch.
Anyway, so you were bored and you decided to work your way from one end of Pico to the other.
Yeah, I started at the old Salvador Cafe, which was near where Pico dead ends into a Coca-Cola bottling plant shaped like a 30 steamship, which I've always thought was astonishing. And I'd go and I'd eat every day. I would go off work and I'd go to the next restaurant and I'd sort of work my way down the street. And it was an education, more than anything I've ever done, I think.
You were a critic for Gourmet magazine based in New York for a little while.
Right.
And you write about the toniest restaurants in Los Angeles sometimes as well. Mm-hmm. What do you like the most about fine dining restaurant food?
Well, the food is freaking great, or at least it can be great. That it's where the most interesting and most innovative chefs wind up. They're the people who usually end up with the best raw materials, that they have the experience and the technique to be able to put it together in a way that's wonderful. The problem is that when the ambitions are high, the skill level and the imagination is often not as high as the ambition, and they fall flat on their face in a way that's just not going to happen in a taqueria. I mean, a taqueria that's awful will last 3 weeks.
Right. There's plenty of places to get tacos.
But when somebody is working on a really high level and they're pulling it off, I mean, it's miraculous. I mean, they actually sort of like, they can change your worldview with what's on a plate.
So when you get to eat a food that changes your worldview, what is it that keeps you going to taco places that, for all you know, might end up sucking?
Well, may I say they don't all change my worldview. I mean, that's the thing. It's like I'm bored out of my mind with a lot of sort of formal restaurant ritual. And I mean, some of it's wonderful. Some of it is there just because it's always been there. And a lot of the restaurants are geared towards people who are A, spectacularly wealthy, or B, celebrating, an anniversary divisible by 5. And those people have different expectations from dinner than I might. It's not about the food, it's about something else. I feel almost violated when I'm going into a place and I'm dropping $500 for dinner, and it's bad. I mean, really, it should be like pitchforks and torches time. I don't know why more people don't rise up against them. And some of the really spectacularly bad, dishonest restaurants have been operating for decades, and I don't know. I guess it is what it is, but I like really good food, and I like really good food wherever I find it. And if I'm going to find it at a taqueria, that's great. And if I'm going to find it at, the newest molecular cuisine restaurant, that's okay too.
I find that in some ways, the more I live in Los Angeles, the less I venture forth into the world, because just going places kind of exhausts me. Mm-hmm. And I feel bummed about that, because I feel like I'm missing out on so much of what Los Angeles has to offer. And I wonder how your life outside of eating has been affected by the fact that your job requires you to haul your ass to Norwalk or Orange, places that you otherwise wouldn't make a point of visiting.
It's, in a lot of ways, it doesn't change that much. I mean, I drive around during the day. I come home. I always cook my kids dinner before I go out. I mean, actually, a lot of times, like, the number one qualification is the dinner that I cook for my kids that I'm leaving behind better than what I have just driven 20 miles and paid $200 for? And actually, an obnoxiously high percentage of the time it is.
It's Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. You're listening to my 2011 conversation with the Pulitzer-winning food writer Jonathan Gold. He died last month at 57.
How many days a week are you going out and eating for work?
Probably 6 out of 7.
And
at least one meal.
It's not that great, and just paying for it and leaving. Are you doubling up on meals in those days sometimes?
Sometimes. I mean, sometimes I'll go to a lot of places. I know that...
Jonathan, you need to understand that while this does not seem like a big deal to you, I think there are probably, a dozen people in the world who eat the way that you do, so it is a big deal to me.
Yeah, I can understand that. I know I figured out one time when I go to about 4 restaurants that I don't review for every restaurant that I do review.
Do you still encounter foods that make you trepidatious?
There are, I mean, I see terror in a plate of scrambled eggs for some reason. I'm just, there's something about like a naked egg that just terrifies me. Are
you cool with other forms of the egg? How about pickled eggs? How do you feel about pickled eggs?
I don't like pickled eggs. I don't like them boiled. I don't like them shirred. I cook eggs every single freaking day, right? It's like I cook more for my family. I cook more eggs than a short order cook, but the idea of eating one it's hard.
Do you have to adjust for your personal taste, or have you managed to broaden your palate to the point where you can eat some weird Thai regional cuisine and you don't have to worry about the fact that you're just not that into Thai cuttlefish?
I try very hard to get beyond that. I mean, I've told the story before, but there was in the 90s a Taiwanese restaurant, and I went into. I just loathed it more than I've loathed any restaurant I've ever been to. I mean, the soup was thickened. It was like okra. I mean, it was like gumbo plus, right? So it was like you take a spoon and it would like snap back into the bowl, and it was flavored. There was a smokiness that wasn't like subtle and wonderful. It was like somebody had stubbed out a cigar in it. And there was something called stinky tofu. I mean, that's what they call it, right? That's not the euphemism. That's like, I think you're getting the idea. This was not my favorite place.
Right.
But I looked around and everybody was enjoying the food. People were well dressed. It was a nice restaurant. It was clear that that the chef was doing exactly what he meant to be doing, that he wasn't messing up, that this wasn't his fault. He was cooking the food exactly the way that he thought it should be cooked. And that the problem was that I was approaching it wrong. And I went back to that restaurant 17 times.
17?
Yeah.
That's a lot of times.
Yeah. And I reviewed it and I talked about all the things that put me off about it, but I think I was able to put it in context, that I was able to look at the food the way that it was meant to be looked at.
That's hard. I mean, food is this thing that means who we are and where we're from, and it's got to be hard to pick up someone else's, cultural context enough to get something that's coming from someone who, until 6 years ago, lived 12,000 miles away.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is incredibly difficult. Like, there's a dish, I hate to bring Taiwan up again, but here we go. It's a beef noodle soup. And in the San Gabriel Valley here, there are probably 50 places that serve it. They all taste pretty freaking close to one another. But you can listen to two Taiwanese people arguing about which is better and why and what the exact QQ of the noodle means, as opposed to this one's slightly softer noodle, as opposed to this one's funkier armpity beef flavor, as opposed to this one's sort of suave broth. And it's probably enough to start wars. And it's...
I know that I've nearly started wars over burritos in my hometown, so I can relate.
Oh yeah, I've started wars between Northern and Southern California burritos. I know you're from the Mission, but I think the Mission burrito is just a monstrosity.
Oh no! There's really nothing you could tell me that would hurt me more than what you just said, Jonathan Gold.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've tried them all.
It's Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. Right now, we're listening back to my interview with Jonathan Gold. Jonathan Gold was the food critic for the Los Angeles Times and the LA Weekly before that. He died last month. He was 57. A few years back, he was the subject of a documentary called City of Gold. Here's an excerpt from it.
My first year out of college, I was working downtown as a proofreader, and I was bored out of my mind. So I decided to make it my project to eat at every restaurant on Pico Boulevard. Pico Boulevard is kind of Los Angeles back porch. It goes through a remarkable swath of town. There's a place called the El Salvador Cafe on the eastern end that was one of the first Salvadoran places in town. And way at the Santa Monica end was a place called Tom's Number 5, which had my favorite chili fries in town. Those were really good chili fries.
Is there anything that you eat here in Los Angeles that makes you proud to be an Angelino in the way that eating a burrito makes me proud to be from San Francisco?
I don't know. I mean, Los Angeles has given many foods to the world. And pretty much all of the national fast food culture comes out of the greater LA area, for better, for worse. LA is where, obviously the Cobb salad was invented, the Caesar salad is, but something that just like breathed Los Angeles that would be just like you walk down a street here and in ordinary block, and you'll see like a half-timbered Tudor house, and you'll see 2 Spanish haciendas, and you'll see an Italian villa, and you'll see a Cotswold cottage, and like all these wonderful kinds of like fantasy domestic architecture that come from all over the freaking world and just exist on one block because this is Los Angeles. And it's a comfortable place for all of that. And as far as something that food that uniquely expresses the culture of LA, I don't know. I mean, I could talk about the East LA green chili burrito.
Jonathan Gold from 2011. This goes without saying, but if you haven't seen the 2015 documentary on Jonathan, City of Gold, it's a really moving tribute to him. You can stream or rent it on a bunch of different platforms. Jonathan is survived by his wife, fellow journalist Lori Ochoa, and their 2 children. Friends of the family are running a GoFundMe to help with funeral expenses and other costs. You can search for it or find a link on the Bullseye page at MaximumFun.org. I'll say here that Jonathan was a hero of mine, both as a journalist and as an Angelino. And it's honestly hard to imagine the city of Los Angeles without him in it. He was a hero to many people here in the MaximumFun.org offices. And whether we met him in person or followed his work, we're very grateful for his life and his contribution to our lives.